Good evening. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you've all had good holidays. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., welcome to our program tonight. We hope you're all celebrating the arrival of spring. It's been a very rough winter for so many across the United States, and we hope that you are doing well. David, my trusted partner, is away this week, but will return next week, and we wish him safe travels. We had not planned any program for this week because tonight, for those on Pacific time, it is still Passover until sundown. But in light of the turmoil in Israel and the Middle East, we asked the great Dennis Ross to brief us at the first possible moment upon his return from the region, and that's tonight. He just got back in the last 30 hours or so, I think. So thank you, Dennis Ross, and thank you, Larry Mantle, and to our audience for your flexibility. And remember, all of our programs are recorded, so you can watch them the next day or any time thereafter. The link to our 150 plus past programs is in every email that David or I send out. Next week, April 19th, we welcome the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen. Admiral Mullen served as the Navy's 28th Chief of Naval Operations and was appointed to 4 different 4-star assignments during his tenure. He brings vast experience gained from his more than 40 years of service. He will analyze the war in Russia, Ukraine, and whether he feels an end is in sight. He will be in conversation with veteran broadcast journalist Warren Olney. And then the week after Mullen, we have April 26th, we have Shira Frankel, prize-winning New York Times technology writer, and her colleague Kevin Roose, also from the New York Times, a technology columnist. They will be discussing artificial intelligence. What is it, and is it good or bad for our democracy? Kevin Roose, just to remind you all, was the first journalist to do an in-depth interview with Microsoft's new chatbot a few weeks ago, chatbot Bing. Many frightening and disturbing revelations during that interview prompted Microsoft to immediately place new limits on Bing, who, by the way, as described in the article by Kevin Roose, had self-expressed an alter ego he called Sydney. And Sydney had many scary thoughts, including a desire to steal nuclear codes and to marry Kevin Roose, the journalist who was interviewing him and who will be our guest. It will be a fascinating hour, we assure you. Thanks to our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine, former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, David Lehrer, and Caroline Kelly and Rabbi Ken Chazen for your leadership. An announcement about some registration problems. A very small percentage of you is having difficulty registering for events with Eventbrite. You're receiving weird messages which are preventing you from registering. If you just email me, I will either register you or just provide you with the Zoom link before the program begins. We have been unsuccessful in trying to investigate this problem despite our best efforts. Best advice, just send me an email and I'll send you a link. Now it is my honor to welcome former Congressman Mel Levine to introduce our guests tonight. Mel.
Thank you, Janice. I hope my telephone stops ringing, which it will, I think, in a moment. I don't know how to stop it. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. Okay, the telephone has stopped ringing. We very warmly welcome Ambassador David Ross, Dennis Ross back. Dennis, as everybody in this audience, I think, well knows by now, is one of America's foremost longtime premier diplomats. He's been central to American policy, particularly in the Middle East, and has served in every administration between Carter and Obama with increasing significance and prominence as he's moved through those administrations. He began his career as an expert on Russia. And so if people have questions with regard to Russia, or Larry does, don't hesitate. This is still a subject near and dear to Dennis's heart, and he remains extremely knowledgeable. But he moved quite a while ago, being more engaged in Middle East policy. I relied frequently on Dennis's insights when I served in Congress. And after And after I left Congress, worked very closely with Dennis on several ventures designed to build on the Oslo peace process and enhance the chance of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Those and other efforts did not succeed at that time. I'll be interested in Dennis's view as to whether he thinks those prospects can ever be revived, and how ultimately Israel's current huge crisis will play out. Interviewing Dennis will be the very much awarded and respected Larry Mantle, who we are honored to return to interview Dennis this evening. Larry has been the host of Air Talk on NPR, NPR's KPCC station since April 1st, 1988, having just celebrated his 38th birthday on Air Talk. Air Talk is the longest running daily talk show in Southern California, and we are delighted to have Larry back with us, and I lateral the ball to Larry to interview Dennis.
Thank you, Mel, and Janice as well. It's a pleasure to be with you once again for America at a crossroads, especially after the holiday observances of Passover and, of course, Easter just last Sunday as well. And we thank you so much for joining us for a Thursday night presentation because of Passover just ending. Ambassador Ross, it's great to talk with you again. The first time we spoke was back in 2004 for your book, The Missing Piece. And it's been an eventful 19 years, needless to say, since that time. So thank you for joining us tonight. First, you're just back from Israel, as has been mentioned, dramatic street protests over the now postponed effort to reform the judiciary, more rockets fired from Lebanon than we've seen since 2006, conflicts within Israel and from outside. What did it feel like to be there on this trip?
Larry, it's a really interesting question because I had a feeling I was in a country that, even though I'm enormously familiar with, I felt like there was a tectonic shift taking place. And what I mean by that is there were people who are preoccupied with what's going on in Israel in a way I've never seen it before. Think about the fact that this is a country that obviously is a vibrant one. Everything is debated. It's not new to anybody. What is new is to see for 13 straight weeks, you had a turnout of anywhere from 2.5% to 4% of the entire Israeli population, demonstrating people who never went to the street before, people who would never have considered that before. They felt that the issue of democracy itself was at stake. That's last Saturday night after the pause. When I say the pause, Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, made a decision to pause the process of pushing the legislation which would have begun to overhaul the Israeli judiciary. He did so in response to what was not just 13 weeks, but a set of spontaneous reactions that were completely unprecedented. For the first time in Israel's history, reservists from the most elite units, by the way, reservists from the most elite units said they would not take part in their, quote, voluntary reserve training. Quite significant when 3/4 of the pilots are reservists. You had, in addition to the reservists saying they wouldn't do it, unprecedented, for the first time ever, you had a general strike called based on an agreement between the head of the Histadrut, the Labor Federation of Israel, and the entire leadership of the private sector in Israel, the banking sector, the high-tech sector, the business sector. They literally sat down, came together, and forged an agreement that they would call a general strike. All the universities went on strike. All the hospitals went to only an emergency situation. Completely unprecedented, meaning that Israelis who had never been active from a political standpoint made a decision that what was at stake was democracy itself. Now, it's interesting for me to say that because I'll tell you, the people who have pushed the reform for the judicial reform, they say democracy is at stake. So two sides of this argument are saying democracy is at stake. To put this in perspective, or at least to be fair, 70% of the Israeli public wanted a pause in the process. They wanted a dialogue on the issue of reform, and they wanted a compromise. So that the 30% who are pushing for this, they're clearly a minority right now in Israel, but it might be useful for me to explain
Yeah.
why do they
About
think.
what's proposed. Yeah, it would be interesting because I think many of us know that it's about not giving the Supreme Court the final word on legislation, but what are some of the other things that it would do to curtail the power of the court?
So there are 4 provisions that have been pushed. Only one at the end was the one that was being pushed immediately. And I want to explain those provisions, but I want to explain something else. I want to explain why those who are pushing this were also saying they were pro-democracy, not anti-democracy. Then I'll explain why 70% of the public obviously taking a somewhat different view. 4 provisions. The first one is to have, have judges selected in a new way, meaning up until now, you had a committee of 9 dominated by the Bar Association and the Supreme Court justices themselves, who determined who would be judges in Israel. This reform was to make it a political process. You take the Bar Association out, you take the judges out, and you basically introduce political people. The initial proposal was to have not just a majority, but a strong majority from the existing government and coalition. They softened that to ensure they would still have a majority, and they would get to pick 2 judges to begin with. And the whole idea was that you would create a set of political criteria for the judges as opposed to what existed before. That was provision number 1. Provision number 2 was that in every department, in every agency in Israel, you have a minister and you also have a legal advisor. Up until now, the Civil Service Commission in Israel selected those legal advisors. The legal advisor did not answer to the minister in his ministry. The legal advisor answered to the Attorney General, who again is even though appointed by the Prime Minister, is traditionally a nonpartisan position and person. The third provision was to take what is a concept that has developed. Israel does not have a constitution. It created a series of basic laws. These are like chapters in a constitution. The court led by Aharon Barak, who was a confidant of Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin brought him to, he was his attorney general. He brought him to Camp David. He was very close to him, but he was a very activist president of the Israeli Supreme Court. And he defined a concept of reasonableness. When you looked at these basic laws, if there was a law in the Knesset that on a standard of reasonableness seemed to be inconsistent with one of the basic laws, the Supreme Court could invalidate that law. This is I will say it's a very broad definition of reasonableness. So the idea was to either do away with that concept or to scale it back dramatically. Okay. So that was the third provision. And then the fourth provision was a judicial override provision, that the Knesset could override the Supreme Court with a majority of 1, 61-59. Meaning in Israel is a parliamentary system. It means there is no difference between the executive branch and the legislative branch. The legislative branch is essentially an extension of the executive branch because the majority in the parliament is what produces the government. If the government wants something in the parliament, unless it loses its majority, it gets whatever it wants. So the only break on that, the only break on executive power is an independent judiciary. Now, these 4 provisions were seen as violating fundamentally separation of powers and denying the judiciary any independence. So why would people claim this was a democratic move? Their argument is the following. The people who dominate the judiciary in Israel are overwhelmingly Ashkenazi, meaning they are Israelis of European descent. The Mizrahi, who are the Israelis from the Arab world, have been significantly underrepresented in the judiciary. So number one, there was a feeling this is a kind of Ashkenazi elite. It has a worldview that is basically left of center. They're not elected, and they can invalidate the laws that come from a Knesset of people who are actually elected. So this is actually an anti-democratic institution that basically blocks what is a institution that reflects what the public wants. That is the essence of their argument. Now, there are a lot of ways to address it, obviously, that don't necessarily involve these four provisions.
Well, Ambassador, I just wanted to ask him, it sounds like you've got essentially those that have been pushing for this reform of the judiciary with the claim that separation of powers really is of far less importance than there being folks who are politically chosen by elected leaders to go into those positions. So, yeah, I mean, some of us would think, well, that's a narrow definition of democracy that you're essentially politicizing. And I just want, so what's the response to the critique of that in removing the separation of powers, you allow for more extremes within government to run roughshod, even over what would be majority will?
Look, I think that the irony is that there is nothing to protect minority rights if, in fact, these four provisions were actually instituted. I want to say something that is a little bit, many people here, and I would put, including myself, focus much more on the override provision. Because the first two provisions, it's hard to say they're anti-democratic when we have them, right? I mean, you cannot say we don't have political criteria for selecting Supreme Court justices. We have Republican, Justice Roberts may say we don't have Republican and Democratic judges. It's pretty clear we have Republican and Democratic judges. And we're not unique in that respect. Other democracies also basically use political criteria to appoint Supreme Court justice. So you can't say it's anti-democratic, but it certainly was inconsistent with the Israeli tradition. Similarly, the idea that you have a legal advisor in a department who doesn't answer to the minister, that again doesn't fit our character, our tradition. Every one of our legal advisors or the legal counsel in every ministry here or every department is appointed by the cabinet secretary. So these are not anti-democratic moves. And I think here many people, and I said including myself, focus less on these and more on the issue of the override provision, because here you could allow a very narrow majority to overrule the Supreme Court. And if you have a very extreme government, as we do right now, that really argued that could be the end, that could be majoritarian rule, not, in a sense, not real democracy where you protect minority rights.
Ambassador, so we have the polls that you cited that show that Israelis, by an overwhelming majority, wanted a pause. We've also seen recent polls which show Netanyahu with less favorable view of the Israeli electorate. So what does this mean for the future of the effort to reform the court and the future for the right-wing government majority as it exists now in this coalition?
I think it's a really interesting question, because the first thing I want to say about the polls, if you looked at polls in Israel for the last 10 years, all the movement was within blocks. If you had the center and left block, different parties might go up or down within that block. The same on the right. Different parties might go up or down within that block, but there was no movement between the blocks. What this effort at reform has produced, at least in the polling right now, is a colossal movement between the blocks. And the movement is from the right to the center left. Just to give you an idea, the most recent polls, and they've been consistent now, the most recent polls showed the current government, if there was an election today, by the way, there won't be because of what I'm about to say. If there was an election today, the 64 the current government has would go to 46. That is truly a dramatic change. And it means a significant part of Likud, people who vote for Likud, would leave. Just to give you an idea of that, the Likud has 32 today, they would drop to 20. Again, you don't see those kinds of changes in Israeli polling I can't think of an example. Maybe I'd have to think hard. Is there one period where we can see that kind of a precipitous drop? Or Benny Gantz, who is the fourth largest party today, poll show he'd go from 12, his party, National Unity, would go from 12 to 29. So what explains this? I think what explains this is something that no one has focused on, but I want to highlight it. For years, there has been, I think, a resentment within Israel that the ultra-Orthodox, they don't pay taxes, they get subsidized by the state, they don't serve in the military. There was an old joke, and I tell you, it's been around for a long time in Israel, that a third of the people pay taxes, a third of the people go to the army, and a third of the people work. The problem is they're all the same third. There was a sense that all these years, there's been a kind of resentment. I can tell you, I looked at a poll 2 years ago, and I was actually shown by one of the leading pollsters in Israel, this poll that showed the least respected, liked people in Israel are the ultra-Orthodox religious. And I asked the question, why is it that we don't see that reflected in the elections? And the answer was twofold. The religious only vote. They have only one issue. They vote only on the religious questions. Everybody else who's more secular, they have different priorities. So they vote on a variety of different issues. But there was this pent-up frustration. And what we've seen here is a twofold reaction. Reaction number one was the idea you're going to take away democracy. But reaction number two, and I think it accounts for the depth and the emotion of the response and why you're seeing a movement from the right. This second emotion was, we have people who are going to impose their values on us. They looked at what is the religious who are basically going to force us to live according to what they want. One of the laws that was passed, by the way, was no hametz. You couldn't have nothing that would not be kosher for hospital, could be in kosher for Passover, could be in any Israeli hospital. Okay, that's a law they passed. And it was seen as they're going to impose their way of life on us. That was part of this. The other part of it was you have this is kind of a misnomer, the religious Zionists. This is the Smotrich, Ben Gvir. These are guys who were Kahanaists, Mayor Kahana, who were fringe before, who got voted into this government for reasons I can probably explain, mostly related to personal security issues. And they have an agenda. The reason they want the judicial change, why does the religious want the judicial change? Because they don't want the court to have their yeshiva students have to serve in the military. The far right wants to change because frequently the court invalidates what they want to do in the West Bank, where they take territory, Palestinian property, and they want to be able to do this uninhibited. What you have in Israel is not a consensus on what to do with the Palestinians, but a consensus that you cannot impose these two sets of interests and value on the rest of the country. Even people from Likud, this was not what they were voting for.
So that diffusing then of the secular vote maybe is cohering as a kind of a backlash against what they're perceiving as a religious overreach in the law. Ambassador, I wanted, because of our limited time, and we can come back to some of these domestic issues within Israel, but talk about the threat from outside, concurrent with what was going on the streets of Israeli cities, was the UN Atomic Energy Agency discovering Iranian centrifuge cascades with uranium residue enriched to 84%. Weapons grade is 90%, so that gap comparatively small. And you have a number of suggestions for the United States to avoid unilateral Israeli military action, because you say if the U.S. doesn't act, that Israel is going to act before that 90% is reached. So before we get to your suggestions for the U.S., why should Israel attacking Iranian nuclear facilities be avoided? Why would that be such a devastating event?
So let me answer this by first explaining why the potential for an independent Israeli action is going up, and then what the implications may be. It's going up because by the end of this year, if Iran stays on the current path that it's on, and there seems to be nothing that's going to stop it right now, they will have 10 bombs worth of enriched material to 60% enrichment. It's correct, as you said, weapons grade is 90%. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the nuclear watchdog agency for the UN, it found that the Iranians had enriched particles to 83.7%. Now, I said they could have 10 bombs worth of material enriched to 60%. To go from 60% to 83.7 or 90% can be done very quickly. And the reality is there's going to come a point where Israel will say, we can't continue to wait until they have, even though that's not a bomb, enriched material we can track and we can know. The move towards a bomb is harder to track and to know. Now, we can't wait for them to get to the point where they have 15 bombs worth of material enriched to that, and we might not be certain of exactly where they are in terms of converting the ability to convert that into a bomb, number one. Number two, all the sites that the Iranians have right now, they have been hardening, meaning they're building them to become less and less vulnerable to an attack. We developed a weapon called the massive ordnance penetrator that can basically destroy any hardened target, including one of their enrichment sites is built into a mountain. There comes a point where if Israel doesn't act, they lose the ability to have an effect, given the combination of hardening and the size and the number of bombs that the Iranians could actually have. So from an Israeli standpoint, the clock is ticking. And if they wait too long, they lose the option. And from an Israeli standpoint, this is an existential threat. This is a country that says Israel should not exist. They say it repeatedly. And so given Israel's history, you don't dismiss words like that. And you look at the behavior of the Iranians, you don't dismiss these words. Now, the problem is if the Israelis do it on their own, you know how the war starts. You don't know how it ends. I can tell you, Israel knows what will happen to it. Hezbollah is in a position where it could hit Israel with about 3,000 rockets a day for about 3 weeks. Hamas can do 500 rockets a day for a couple weeks. That's, Israel will have to go in on the ground. Same time it's doing this against Iran, it's going to have to go in on the ground into Lebanon to be able to the only way they can stop the onslaught is to actually go in on the ground. They can't do it exclusively from the air. And their missile defenses can be overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. So you have that side of it. But I'll tell you, the Iranians are almost certain to hit the Saudis if the Israelis hit them. Why? Because the nature of, to take out the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, you have to hit a lot of other targets as well. You have to take out all their air defense so that you can hit these sites repeatedly. The air defense is located in a lot of areas where you have significant economic capabilities. A lot of their oil-related infrastructure is, not surprisingly, where their air defense is. They put the air defense in to protect that. So from the Iranian standpoint, they're going to say, we're not going to be the only ones who are going to pay a price. And they'll hit the Saudis in part also to show the cost of what happens when you hit them. The odds of us being able to stay out of this are very low. So rather than face that kind of a scenario that begins in a way you can predict and is hard to define exactly how it ends, you want to preempt it to begin with. So what you need to do is you've got to be able to deter. You got to get the Iranians to say, okay, the path we're on is too dangerous, so they stop. You have to be able to reverse it, but at a minimum, you have to get them to stop.
Well, and let's talk about, because you have four things you think the U.S. should do, the first of which is to take a much harder rhetorical line and to be very clear that what Iran is doing puts at risk all of its nuclear infrastructure, including civilian nuclear infrastructure as well. Do you think the Biden administration would tonally accept making that kind of very direct and specific threat?
I think the answer today is no. And I think the reason is not because they don't recognize the threat right now, but I think they're trying to reconcile, on the one hand, keeping the focus on Russia, Ukraine, and China, and not on Iran. And the minute you you take this kind of a rhetorical posture, you're shifting the attention, and you're also beginning to prepare the ground. Actually, one of the reasons you need to do this, one of the reasons the Iranians would be impressed, they'll understand something's changed. And they'll understand we're beginning to prepare the ground for what we might actually have to do. The administration does not want to divert attention away from Russia, Ukraine, for fear that it becomes harder to sustain what we're doing to support the Ukrainians. It's an understandable concern. The problem is, at some point, if we don't do what I'm suggesting, we're going to face a war, which is a much bigger diversion of attention away. By the way, here, the Chinese, there's much we could do with the Chinese on this issue. The Chinese do not want the kind of war I'm describing in the Middle East. Very much against their interests. They still are the biggest consumer of oil from the Middle East. So it's not in their interest for there to be a war there. It is in the Russian interests.
So what could China do to help back Iran off?
They have leverage. They have a lot of leverage on the Iranians. They could go to them and say, you know, unless you stop what you're doing on the nuclear program, we're going to stop the economic help we're providing you. And they are. So they have more leverage on Iran than anybody else right now. So I would like to see the administration go to the Chinese and say, okay, look, we're competing in a lot of areas, but here we have a common interest. You don't want a war there. We don't want a war there. We're telling you a war will come. To give you a sense of this, in 2009, when I was in the Obama administration, I was sent by the administration, by the White House, to China to talk about the risk of the Iranian nuclear program at that time. And one of the things I said to them is, if you think the United States can stop Israel from going after the Iranian nuclear program, think again. For the Israelis, it's an existential threat. They will not listen to us. The only thing that will stop this is if they think that the kind of pressure that we're going to put on will change the Iranian behavior. And the Israelis do believe the right kind of pressure can have that effect.
Let's talk about the other proposals. If you want to get another swig of water, I'll share those and then you can respond. The other is to do air-to-ground rehearsals on military exercises to really demonstrate your willingness, the U.S.'s willingness to defend Israel militarily. Also, for the U.S. to retaliate for Iranian proxy attacks and to target militia camps that are used by Iran. So you've got multiple proposals there. The thing that I think many of us wonder about is U.S. public opinion on this. If the U.S. starts, doing more joint exercises, doing more of this work with testing of hardware and the like, making strikes, even if not claiming responsibility for it, but the U.S. makes strikes on Iranian camps. What's going to be the domestic response here in the U.S. to that?
Look, it is a very fair question. And I think, again, it's part of the reason that the administration is hesitant to take some of these moves. I think what is required is the administration needs to explain it. You can't switch a policy without explaining. I mean, one of the things I think and this is true for almost every administration, including, I've been a part of 5 different administrations, Republican and Democratic alike. And I would say very few have explained policies in the foreign policy area as much as they need to. It's as if, you say one thing and you say everybody gets it. That's not the case. There has to be repetition. You have to be very clear. I think that the irony is the more time you spend explaining to the American public why we're going to have to take certain steps, you're also sending a message. The Iranians hear that too. They see that. That's an interesting signal that, okay, something is changing on the part of America. We have to change the Iranian calculus because today they think they're not running a risk. And it's a colossal mistake, by the way, because they are. Even, by the way, with the Biden administration. they will end up pushing the Biden administration to do something it actually doesn't want to do. So what I'm trying to do is, the thrust of what I'm suggesting is, we are going to face a war that is a pretty awful, I think, a pretty awful war in terms of controlling it, unless we take these kinds of steps. And one thing to do is to basically explain to the public, Iran has embarked on a pathway. If it doesn't stop, it's going to trigger a war. None of us want that war. In the end, even the Iranians don't want that war. But we have to put them on notice the risks they're running.
Ambassador, I want to continue on this line of U.S. domestic response, because you've written that in the future, fewer Americans are going to have the sense of connection with Israel that those of us that are older in this country have had, regardless of our backgrounds. There is that connection with Israel that the U.S. has had. And do you think it's going to be possible with the demographic shifts, with younger people's many of their critical attitudes towards Israel, and understandable about increasing settlement construction outside the blocks and other activities that the Israeli government has done that offend the sensibilities of many Americans? So is that relationship going to be able to continue?
Excuse me. Look, one of the most interesting things right now, if you ever wanted a demonstration that Israel is a vibrant democracy, you're seeing it. There is no other country in the Middle East where you can even have a demonstration. I get all choked up talking about this. There is no other country in the Middle East that can have a demonstration without it being met with absolute sheer brute force. People being arrested, people being killed. In Israel, we've seen 13 weeks of up to 4% of the population demonstrating. This is a grassroots response. We're seeing the power of democracy in Israel. It is the only democracy in the Middle East. I believe we're going to see it affect the behavior of this Israeli government. We already have to some extent. It's going to be interesting to see how does it affect other policies. But yes, look, some of the policies of this government, especially in the West Bank, will trigger increasing disaffection here. But I have to say, when you take a step back and you look at the character of the Israeli democracy and the manifestation of how deeply it's rooted, I think that becomes a pretty strong selling point, that this is the one country in the region that really does share values with the United States. And what we're seeing right now is, if this government stays on the path it's on, there will be an election at some point and it will be voted out. And you'll have a very different kind of government as a result. So I think that's one of the ways not to see the kind of break that you could see. I think a real wedge being driven between the United States and Israel. And I think it's also an appeal to the younger generation here. I do a lot of speaking on campuses. And right before I went to Israel, I was speaking on I was at 3 different campuses, and I was making this point. There are a lot of things you might be critical about in terms of this Israeli government, but take a look at the Israeli public and look at its reaction and look at what it's doing to preserve democracy in the state of Israel.
Is a two-state solution in the Middle East possible, given the extreme views that we've had, comparatively extreme views of the current Israeli government, and the lack of cohesive leadership, either with the Palestinian Authority or certainly with Hamas in Gaza? I mean, is that still something you hold out hope that there can be a two-state solution?
Yeah. Do I still hold to it? The answer is yes. Do I think it's something that's achievable in the near term or even the intermediate future? No. The politics on each side make it impossible right now. On the Palestinian side, you have complete division between the West Bank and Gaza, between Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Hamas rejects the idea of Israel's right to exist. It claims all of that territory, it says, is part of an Islamic trust, and they're not prepared to concede anything. The Palestinian Authority has no legitimacy any longer with its own public. And so no leadership that lacks legitimacy is going to take big steps that take on traditional narratives. So there, the divisions there make it impossible. Everybody's positioning themselves for succession on the Palestinian Authority. Succession is never a period characterized by moderation. On the Israeli side, you have a government today that rejects the idea of two states. I think a majority in Israel no longer favors two states, and it's the same with the Palestinians. I don't think it's because either rejects it as a principle. I think both reject it because they think it's never going to happen. So why psychologically invest in it? If you can take the kind of steps that show you could achieve it, and when I say that, take the kind of steps that restore a sense of possibility. Both sides have lost the view that anything can be done. When you lose hope, when there's no sense of possibility, then the sense that anything can change is also lost. If you can reintroduce a sense of possibility, you can bring back the concept of two states. But the problem, and here, what this government does is important, this Israeli government. If you get past the point where you can no longer separate Israelis and Palestinians, then two states, as we've traditionally thought of it, is practically not possible. You then have to begin to think of some alternatives. What about a confederation? A confederation, by definition, is two states that join together, but there's a kind of loose connection. The logic of a confederation would be, okay, of all the Israelis who live in the West Bank, they don't have to move, but the confederation, you can shape governance in terms of where the Jewish Israelis are is one thing. That doesn't include, by the way, the Arab Israelis, because they are Israeli citizens. Anybody who is an Israeli citizen, can be governed by the Israelis in a kind of confederal arrangement. And I don't view that as a simple proposition. I think it's really hard to do.
Okay.
That's why I want to preserve the prospect of separation.
I have a number of questions to share with you, Ambassador, from our viewers. We have one from Jeff in Pasadena, asks if there is a general agreement among Israeli society that there is a need for some sort of reform of the judiciary. And if there is, what type of reform do you think is needed?
Look, I would say, when I cited the 70% figure, in some ways, I think that 70% figure is even low. I think that you certainly have 70 to 75% who want to see a compromise. I think there is a strong impulse for it. So what would a compromise look like? Let me go through each of the provisions to give you a sense. I want to start
just briefly. I got a lot of questions for you.
All right, I'll do it fast. Instead of 61, you can have an override provision, but it has to have a clear majority of Israelis that would include the opposition. So 70 to 75, you'd have to have 70 to 75 vote for it. That means by definition, you're including the opposition. So if there's that much consensus, that's one thing. Pretty hard to get that much consensus. And also, you allow the Supreme Court the ability to override if there's a majority of Supreme Court justices. That is, I think, a very doable compromise. On the issue of the reasonable standard, there again is a sense that this should be more restricted. The definition and interpretation of basic law should also become more narrow, so you don't even need the reasonable provision. On the issue of legal advisors, I don't think that's a make or break proposition. I think it's kind of more of kind of a red herring. So I think that they'll work out. The hardest one is who's going to pick the judges. And here, I think there'll be some kind of compromise that demonstrates that the government doesn't have an absolute majority. I'll give you an example. So I'm not saying this is what it's going to be, but let's say you have a committee of 9. What if you have 4 if you want to make it more political, what if you have 4 from the government, 4 from the opposition, and the Supreme Court judge is kind of the arbiter of this? I mean, I think, I'm not saying that's what the compromise will be, but it's an illustration that a compromise is possible.
All right. Susan asks, what do you see as the impact of renewed Saudi-Iranian diplomatic relations?
You know, I want to put this in perspective because I don't think it's a fundamental game changer. Iran has not changed its objectives for the region. It wants to dominate the region. The Saudis know Iran wants to dominate the region. And they don't believe in agreeing to this, that they're changing their longer term objective. This is a tactical adjustment by both sides. For 2 years, there has been a dialogue between the Saudis and the Iranians. And I can tell you, I happen to know the Saudi who's been the negotiator on the Saudi side. And for 2 years, that person has told me, we have one condition: to restore relations and open embassies. The Iranians have to use their influence to get the Houthis in Yemen to stop. No more missiles into Saudi Arabia, and to be open to ending the conflict. Now, there's a Saudi delegation in Yemen this week because of the agreement with the Iranians. For 2 years, the Iranians hadn't been willing to promise that. After 2 years, they were. Why did the Iranians want to do that? They don't like being politically isolated in the region. They want to demonstrate that, in effect, they can change the kind of in a correlation of forces in the region. They want to send a message that they're not, in a sense, they can compete with what looked to be a kind of Sunni Arab Israel front that they were dealing with, their effort to try to separate some of that. So they had a tactical set of reasons. The Saudis had a tactical set of reasons. It serves both their interests. If you ask me, this is something that probably works for the next year or so. I would be, if I come back and we talk about this in a year and a half, let's see if it really is continuing.
We'll plan on that.
Yeah.
Eric in Los Angeles asks, can you please discuss how the military leaks will affect our relationship with Israel, Ukraine, etc., how Russia might change their policies because of the leaks? And also in the leaks, we have Washington Post reporting that U.S. intelligence thought that Egypt had made a secret deal to supply rockets to Russia, for example. So you got a lot of messiness, a lot of deep concerns that have come out of these leaks.
Yeah, look, I'll tell you, I was in the Obama administration when WikiLeaks came out. And I remember how much time we had to spend with allies, those who were not necessarily allies, but friendly, and even adversaries, because of the embarrassment of this. And WikiLeaks was very precise because these were cables, and many of the cables were very blunt cables. So this is going to confront the Biden administration with a need for a constant set of messages designed to reassure. Some of these documents have clearly been doctored, without question. But unfortunately, a lot of them have not been. And on the one hand, the first question that everybody's going to ask is, how can we trust you with any secrets? This is what happened during WikiLeaks, by the way. I myself was asked to engage in a lot of the discussions with those who were upset. And I can tell you how often I got that. How can we have a serious private conversation with you on anything highly sensitive? Not me individually, but the U.S. administration. It created an unsettled reality. I would say it took us a good 6 months to get beyond it. The administration is going to find something rather similar in this. I mean, I have to say, I mean, having been someone who spent 25 years in different administrations with the highest level of clearances, I do not understand how a 21-year-old Air National Guard reservist had access to all this.
I was going to ask you how that could even happen.
I know all the different classification levels. I do not understand how he had access to this material. I mean, it requires the intelligence community across the board to go back and make a very thorough reassessment of how we have been distributing documents of different levels of classification. Some of the things that were there, I understand. I was in Israel when this, the idea, one of the documents said the Mossad was behind the demonstrations in Israel. It was completely absurd. And it wasn't a doctor document, but I understand this was a lower level classification. And they, in a lot of these kinds of classified documents, you can have unclassified paragraphs. The heading is a classified document, but you can have an unclassified paragraph. I have no doubt that someone probably inserted media stories on the fact that Mossad, because there were these stories out there, I saw them, that Mossad was involved. They were not involved. It is true that former heads of Mossad, including Tamir Pardo, were addressing the demonstrators. And every single one of the former national security advisors wrote a letter asking for a dialogue, stop the process. So there was some extrapolation, and somehow that got interpreted in a way that was just, I think, it reflected no understanding of the reality.
Let's move to another question. Susan asks, the editor of The Forward recently argued that American Jews cannot stay out of the conflict in Israel. She urged American Jews to essentially call their members of Congress and ask them to withhold military aid from Israel if the judicial reform goes through. And I can't verify that that's what was written, but this Susan says that's what was in The Forward. How do you see the role of American Jews and how they should respond to the conflict in Israel?
I would draw a distinction here. I don't think you touch Israeli security. The idea that right now, Israel just took 34 rockets from Lebanon, okay, from Hamas in Lebanon. It took rockets from Syria. It took rockets from Gaza. It's facing potentially an existential threat with the Iranian nuclear program. The idea that you're going to somehow withhold military assistance at a time when they're facing these kind of threats from actors for whom democracy is something that they'll do everything they can to try to prevent, that makes no sense. Now, having said that, shared values is an underpinning of the U.S. Israeli relationship. If Israel is going to be adopting policies that fundamentally call into question those shared values, American Jews have a right to have their voice heard on that. I would add even something else. One of the laws that was being pushed was to change the law of return for basically who's a Jew, redefine who's a Jew. This is coming again from the ultra-Orthodox. It gets to this issue I was saying before about they're going to impose their values on everyone else. Israel is the state of the Jewish people. It calls itself the state of the Jewish people. So if you're going to enact legislation that affects the standing of Jews outside of Israel, they have a right. They have a duty to be able to say, you don't get to make these kinds of decisions that are going to affect us with us being silent.
We have just
on the security questions, war and peace issues. People living here, they're not affected by it. People living there are.
We have just a few minutes remaining and so many great questions. Many have asked about your views of the Israeli storming of the mosque and Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
I'm glad the question was asked. I asked when I was there, I said, I understand you're in a lose-lose situation. The people who are going into the mosque and who barricaded themselves, they're doing it for a reason. They want to provoke you. They're bringing stones in. They're bringing fireworks in. They want to provoke you to come in. You really don't want to play into their hands. Now, the answer I got was, the problem is, and this, by the way, one of the things that Bibi did do is he's not allowing the last 10 days of Ramadan Israelis to go up on the Temple Mount. One of the things I heard from the security establishment I was dealing with, the reason that we felt we had to go in is because if they stayed in all night and then they came out, they were going to come out at the time when they would be throwing stones, fireworks, and the Israelis are going up. We would have big clashes there. That is, can easily get out of hand. We had to prevent that. Now, I said to them, Look, here's the problem. Both sets of images are bad. One is worse than bad. When you send Israeli heavily armed forces into the sanctuary, the third most revered sanctuary, the Oscar Mosque, for Muslims, that's something that sets everybody on fire throughout the Middle East and Muslim communities around the world. If there are clashes outside, it's not good. It's a bad image, but it doesn't rise to the standard of creating this kind of an emotional reaction. It's not the same. Going into the sanctuary is simply different than having a clash outside of it. What is interesting is the day after I had that conversation, again, people barricaded themselves in, and this time the Israelis did not go in. I'm not saying they did it because of my conversation. I think they drew their own conclusion that it didn't make sense, that they could manage what would happen when they came out. So, I guess I'm hoping they came to the same conclusion that I had. And in answer to the question, I think it's a mistake to go in.
One more question I want to squeeze in, but we have to be very brief. We have about 3 minutes left. And Paul asks that assuming at some point Netanyahu is ousted, either criminally or politically, who do you think would be the likely successor as prime minister?
Look, a great deal depends upon the circumstances. I don't see this government falling anytime soon, precisely because they have a stake in avoiding an election if it looks like they're going to lose an election. So, self-preservation is a pretty powerful incentive. If the government falls, over time, and that's possible given the fundamental ideological differences and the fact that some of the people in this government will threaten Netanyahu's legacy that matters to him. So if it falls and you have an election, if you ask me today, I would say Benny Gantz and his party is the most likely one to emerge if we see a scenario I'm describing. The reason I say that is he's one person who has the ability to appeal across the whole spectrum in Israel. I don't think anybody else today has that capacity.
Ambassador, I'd like to give you a chance to close. We've talked about a lot of issues of major concern in Israel, throughout the Middle East, and of course here in the U.S. as well. You are a diplomat, and diplomats are by nature optimistic people. That's what fuels you, I know, in those diplomatic efforts. So as you look at the situation, what gives you hope?
Look, I still think that Israel is a genuine democracy. And I think the determination to preserve that is what's going to keep it a democracy. I think that has implications for the region. I'll tell you, we haven't seen it yet, but I will predict what's happened in Israel, if things work out the right way, will have a contagion effect throughout the rest of the region. We're going to see sooner or later, more and more people in the region are going to be asking the question, how come they have the power to affect their future and we don't? That, I think, that puts a pressure on a lot of regimes there, if nothing else, to deliver economic goods, to become more responsive, at least that way. Maybe not politically so much, but to create a different level of governance and improve governance. So that gives me hope.
All right. Ambassador, thank you so much. We so appreciate your expertise as well as your firsthand experience from your very recent return from Israel. Thank you for being with us again, sir. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you. Next week, former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, on war in Europe. Is there a winning formula? Warren Olney will be in conversation with Admiral Mullen. That's next Wednesday, back to our usual night of Wednesday, 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern. And thank you for financially supporting these programs as well. If you've not done so, remember, you can donate by going to the website of either Community Advocates, Inc., or of Jews United for Democracy and Justice, those two organizations collaborating on these special, typically Wednesday night programs. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and good night.